Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ray Francis. I'm the Dean of Arts at Monash University, and it's my great privilege to be your MC for tonight's exciting event. And what a privilege it's been to hear the Monash Jazz Quartet as we were having our drinks outside. Kieran Rafferty on drums, Patrick Schmidl on bass, Stephen Byth on saxophone, and Anthony Barnhill on keyboard. Please join me in thanking them. We'll hear more of the Monash Quartet later, and I also acknowledge the work of Mary Finstra, whose eloquent music was playing as we came in this evening on the credits. As you can see by your program, there's a rich event ahead of us this evening: speeches, film and song, and of course a lecture by our distinguished visiting Professor Jay Winter, who will be launching the 100 Stories project. And given all we have to do, it's especially important that you note the emergency exits clearly labelled in the theatre, just in case anybody spills water or worse on the electrics. And in the unlikely event that we do have an emergency, could you please remain seated until someone tells you what to do? Before we begin, you'll all do that. Before we begin, can I acknowledge, on behalf of us all, the traditional owners of this land, the Kulin Nations, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And we also acknowledge the Indigenous communities right across Australia whose stories have featured in the book of the 100 Stories. And finally, can I acknowledge you? It's wonderful there are so many people here tonight, and we have many distinguished guests amongst us, including the Honourable John Pandazopoulos, the Honourable Tony Robinson, representatives of a host of cultural institutions, and Monash University Council. So a particular welcome to those distinguished guests. And a special mention must be made of our very special guest of honour, the author of Sacred Places, a landmark work about commemoration in Australia, Emeritus Professor Ken Inglis. Finally, I'd particularly like to welcome those people who are in the spill-out area adjoining the theatre. Tonight's speeches are being broadcast to them as I speak, and all tonight will be captured on film. The compensation for being in the spill-out area is you get to stay in the bar. But to the capacity audience we have physically with us tonight, we should also add an audience from all around the world who will be watching this event in the final episode of the 100 Stories MOOC, streamed next week. Enrolments for that Mass Open Online course, which is what MOOC stands for, have now exceeded 10,000 people, even more than this capacity audience tonight. So wherever you are, in whatever corner of the globe, and whatever space in this beautiful museum, welcome. Originally, we'd planned quite an intimate launch, perhaps 20 or 30 people, and we thought we could walk this little party around the Love and Sorrow exhibition featured here in the Melbourne Museum. Obviously, we can't do that tonight, but perhaps we can do something even better. We've decided to spend the first few minutes of tonight screening the first episode of the MOOC, exploring the Love and Sorrow exhibition. This landmark exhibition, like the landmark book we mark tonight, challenges and extends the way we remember the Great War. It was the launching place for the 100 Stories project. It introduces you to Beck and Laura and Bruce, and it's the ideal backdrop for Jay Winter's lecture tonight. So here we go. We hope.
We're standing outside the exhibition buildings in Melbourne. This magnificent dome structure was built to host the International Exhibition of 1880, an exhibition that showcased the technological, the commercial, the cultural achievements of its time. Victoria's motto was peace and prosperity, and this building, it exudes the confidence, the optimism, the elegance of the Victorian age. Whoever would have thought that just a generation later, the Empire, Australia, indeed all the great nations represented here in 1880 would be wrought asunder by war. We called it the Great War. It would tear Europe apart and it would claim countless thousands of lives. Indeed, a child born when this great dome reached up into the sky had a very, very good chance of dying far, far from home, on the distant battlefields of Gallipoli and Belgium, Palestine and France. And the science celebrated here, the technological advances that had promised to improve the lives of millions, would lay the world to waste. The First World War was the world's first industrialised war, and it was fought with terrifying new weapons of mass destruction. Alongside the exhibition buildings stands Museum Victoria. And to mark the centenary of the Great War, the museum's hosting an exhibition all of its own. The curators have called it Love and Sorrow, and they hope to convey the cost, the unfathomable human cost of the Great War. We've decided to begin our history of the First World War here, because the objects featured in this remarkable exhibition speak to us across the ages. They help us to imagine what now lies beyond living memory. They embody the experience of the men and the women who suffered that catastrophe 100 years ago. This is a recreation of Glencoe Wood in Belgium. The landscape represented here was shattered to pieces by high explosives. This tiny patch of ground alone claimed thousands of lives. Australian lives, British lives, German lives. All the bodies of those men are mingling now in the cold, dark earth of Flanders. And what we see in this landscape is a landscape that's being reborn, because when visitors walk across through this space, their own form is embedded in this landscape, and the woods somehow come to life again. And what that's telling us is that the Great War somehow still affects us all. In the next 5 weeks, we'll walk through woods like this one. We'll take you on a journey across the killing fields of Europe. We'll speak to the historians that have made these landscapes their life's work, and we'll discuss the testimony, the voices from the past that can still whisper through these woods and make this imagined place somehow real. In week 1 of the 100 stories, that's this week, we'll be examining grief and mourning. And you know, really, this honour roll is a perfect place to begin. It records the name of some 90 men, most of them clerical workers from a stock and station agents here in Melbourne. That business would have employed what? A few hundred people? Around 1 in 5 volunteered for overseas service, and 12 of these 90 men never came home.
Fenley MacDonald was killed in Australia's first major action of the Great War, the landing at Gallipoli in April 1915. George Hummerston was killed nearly 3 years later to the day, in the desperate battles to turn back the German offensive in 1918. Both were young men in their 20s, and both left grieving families behind. They never recovered Fenley's body, and names carved in wood and in stone became surrogate graves. Names mattered in the 1920s, and they matter still today, because behind each name lies a story. Stories that we can now recover through archives available online.
An honour roll is an official and very public kind of memorial, but families also had private places where they could grieve. Often these centred around a photograph on the mantelpiece, a shred of uniform, or a letter written from overseas and read and reread time and time again. Recovering the private face of grief is our second task for this week, and sometimes these memorials were incredibly fragile. Like this baby's booty, sent to Daddy Frank from a daughter that he would never live to see.
In week 2, we'll look more closely at how women mobilised for war. And again, we'll divide that topic into 2 separate but related themes.
To begin, we'll look at women's unpaid war work, the writing of letters, knitting of socks, the emotional labour that connected women with their menfolk far away on battlefields overseas. And we'll look at women's actual war service, the nurses who confronted the physical and the psychological trauma of war.
It wasn't all trauma, of course. For the woman who wore this uniform, nursing was also a great adventure, a chance to see the world. And she recorded her experiences on a camera like this one. In week 2, we'll explore that woman's view of war and try and share it with you.
Week 3 is devoted to what we call the other Anzac, Indigenous servicemen, whose experience of war has long been ignored in Australia, and the Chinese, the Russian, the Greek, the non-British soldiers who formed an integral and too often forgotten part of the expeditionary forces that were sent from Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Week 4 is entitled War Wounds, and we'll look at the plight of the blind, the crippled and the faceless, the whispering men who died as a result of their gas poisoning, and the cot cases, men who were confined for as long as 40 years in beds like this one.
Modern artillery not only mauled men's faces, it affected their minds too. The second part of War Wounds looks at shell shock, looking at the psychological as well as the physical damage wrought by war.
And in the final week of the MOOC, we're going to look at how the war divided our society, both during and after the fighting, because Australia and the world were never going to be the same again.
The Old Lie looks at the conscription debates, the anti-war movements, and the way the war created a less tolerant and less inclusive society.
A Land Fit for Heroes considers the country that these men came home to, examining the plight of soldier settlers sent out to farm often marginal land.
Every week, we'll provide you with readings, discussion topics, and the chance to debate the big questions raised by the 100 Stories project.
Each week, we'll guide you through the archival sources, introducing the digital narratives that will enable you, anywhere in the world, to explore the lives behind the stories.
At the end of this course, we'll return here to Museum Victoria. We'll talk to the curators and the conservators who worked hand in hand with historians to assemble these objects, to tell their stories, and to create this truly compelling exhibition.
But for now, let's make our way back to the battlefield, where Fenley MacDonald fell on the day of the landing at Gallipoli.
Well, I think you've seen quite enough of me on the big screen, so I promise I won't keep you for very long. But I thought you might just like to know where the book that we're launching tonight really began. It didn't begin with that strikingly handsome volume you've all seen out the front there. That's down to the vision of Andrea McNamara and the wonderful people from Penguin. And it didn't begin with a MOOC. 18 months ago, I didn't know what a MOOC was, and I was a much happier man then, can I say. The 100 Stories began as a digital narrative. They were commissioned by Canberra, by our government, as part of the Anzac Centenary official, until Canberra realised that historians are pledged to tell the truth, however difficult that truth might be, especially about war. And that digital narrative was a sparse but I think really challenging attempt to convey the simple and yet immensely complex testimony of those men and those women that we all honour today. I don't know if we ever succeeded in doing that. I do know that the 100 Stories project, the book, the MOOC, the digital narrative and the mobile phone wouldn't have been possible, wouldn't have been imaginable without the contribution of all the wonderful people whose names you saw scrolling on that screen a moment ago. And it wouldn't have been possible without the energy and the insight of two remarkable early career researchers, Laura James and Beck Wheatley. I think we need young historians like these two to help us approach the past in a radically different way, and we're immensely grateful to both of them. And here comes the advertisement. If you'd like to see more of Beck and Laura, enrol in the MOOC. You can join in a worldwide conversation being led by Jay Winter here about the meaning of the Great War. Thanks to Margaret Harris, to Darryl Evans, to Adrian Devey and all their team for making that conversation possible. And special thanks to our learners in Australia and overseas for the privilege of your company. Wherever you are in the globe, it's been great to have you with us. Finally, I hasten to add that this university course, unlike so many other university courses today, is free. There's no HECS, there's no fees. This is our university's gift to the world. And actually, I think that's what higher education should be, free and open and accessible to all. Very few of us can go to an elite institution like Yale and be taught by Jay Winter, but we can all learn from Jay Winter and the other generous scholars on the MOOC. Please do. In closing, can I add that the 100 Stories wouldn't have been possible without families. the keepers of stories, as Jay has so often said. I know we've got many descendants with us tonight. John Cronin is one of them, and he's asked me to introduce his song very quickly, From Tipperary to Fremantle Station. Now, John wrote this song when he first heard about Fromell. We all know the story of that bungled, pointless battle. We all know the controversy that surrounded those exhumations from the killing fields, and I acknowledge the presence of Lambus and Mike O'Brien here tonight. Now, like any archaeological dig, Fromell reminded us of a world we have lost. This collection of sad little things captures the tragedy, doesn't it, of a whole generation. And perhaps the richest of those relics wrested from the earth is this one. One of the good luck charms carried by almost every soldier of the Great War. It was found sealed in his gas mask, the only place that cardboard wouldn't perish. As you can see, it's a train ticket, economy class return, Perth to Freo. But of course it's so much more than that, isn't it? This man believed he'd be going home, that somehow he'd survived the mass carnage of 1914 to 1918. That gesture of faith and hope is at least as eloquent as any other symbol of remembrance we might wear today. And it inspired John's song. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming John Cronin on guitar, Marcy Taylor on violin. Thank you.
Train ticket in my pocket, my tobacco and a photograph of you. And when the war is over, I will ride that train to you. I want to hear you talk softly, hear you whisper my name. I want to talk to you about the weather, so you can tell me if it's gonna rain. And I want to walk down Chapman Street, drink beer at the Sail and Anchor. I want to dance in their town hall and walk you home past the football oval. I want to hear you talk softly, hear you whisper my name. I want to talk to you about the weather, you can tell me if it's gonna rain. And I don't care if you say I look older, but don't forget who I am. Please don't call me soldier, because it's not my name. Please don't call me soldier, because it's not my name. And it's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to Leicester Square, it's a long way to Fremantle Station, where my love, she waits there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John and Marcy. Please join me in thanking them just one more time. And if you enjoyed that as much as I did, you want to see more of them. And there's a brochure about where they'll be performing next out near the books on the table outside. As John said, that tribute was from one descendant, but maybe it speaks for others of you here tonight. And it also reminds us of something Jay Winter once said. Remembering the Great War, he said, is an attempt to overcome the terrible anonymity of the mass death that marred 1914 to 18. So too, I think, is Jay Winter's scholarship. In a series of publications, broadcasts and documentaries, in the mammoth Cambridge history of First World War, and most recently, the 100 Stories MOOC, Jay has challenged and engaged us all. To list this prize-winning historian's many achievements would take up much of this evening. Suffice to note that Jay Winter has held a string of professorial posts at Cambridge, Yale, and most recently at Monash University. To speak to us tonight, Jay declined another very important engagement overseas, for which we are immensely grateful and privileged to be in his company tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Jay Winter to the stage.
Thank you, Ray, indeed. I came here because personal and family commitments trump academic ones. And the family of scholarship that has produced the book that we're launching this evening is exactly what the future of history ought to be. There are three reasons why I say that. The first is it's collective. We historians for a century, lagging long behind the physicists and so on, have a fetish, indeed almost an obsession with the individual authorial voice. You need to have gray hair, usually, in order to write something together with others, much less produce an online course and get the credit that individual scholars need in order to get jobs and promotion. The second is that it's what I call public history. We're all in it. This is history both inside and outside the academy. And it is the future of the profession. Because if we don't step outside of the academy, there are many people waiting to take our place and to speak of war in different ways. And the third reason I think why this is a quite extraordinary moment is that it marks in powerful ways, there are others alongside it, what I call the visual turn in cultural history. After 50 years of teaching and writing, I've reached the conclusion that what people see matters much more than what they read, including every single word that I've written. It is a delight to see a book in which the visuals are the story. They're not decorations. They're not, in some ways, marginal, but they capture the emotion, which is at the core of the history of the First World War. Now, one thing that I believe can be seen in this book as well, and in the three authors' profiles, and in their collective work, is that memory, and history and memory overlap in important ways, is always about the future. It may surprise you to hear that, but the way we construct the past is dependent upon our vision of the future. And in my view, over the last 15, 20 years working in Europe and in the United States, I've seen a movement in historical scholarship which is part of a more general turn away from war. You might not call it pacifist necessarily, but a way in which many people, not necessarily following the Iraq War, but that's one example of it, came to see that war is no longer a legitimate part of the political life of a nation. It may be an existential part of it. Weapons of mass destruction could threaten us all. That's why I believe that Tony Blair And George Bush had to invent the lies about weapons of mass destruction because it's no longer possible to argue that war is a legitimate defense of a nation's honor or interest. You need something more. And this movement, I think, in the history of war is part of a much broader movement inside and outside of the academy to reconfigure our understanding of war. Because even though, as the poppy I wear today indicates, in one sense, the good news is that the Great War is over. The bad news is that's not quite true. Anyone who looks at the news about refugee camps in Syria are looking at exactly the same places where the survivors of the Armenian genocide took refuge exactly 100 years ago. The Great War is a bit like a recurrent nightmare that refuses to go away. And that's why I believe every generation must go back to the Great War to understand something monstrous happened on the battlefields of the whole world between those years, which is deeply ingrained in our society today. Now, there's a second fundamental reason why I think this book captures an important moment. It is, in many respects, important in the sense of capturing the sense that language is constitutive of history. By that I mean, there are no facts outside of the language in which they are expressed. And we, therefore, have to go and listen to the voices of the people who lived through the war and to hear their echoes. That's why I was so happy to hear that my brief remarks will have followed a much more poetic voice of the two musicians who preceded me. This is not the first time, I have to say, this happened. The 11th of March last year in Central Hall, Westminster, I spoke to a meeting of 1,000 history teachers throughout the British Isles about how to teach the Great War. And before me spoke the playwright Michael Merpergo, who wrote War Horse. And what did he do? He sang the songs of his play. What an act to follow. And the reason why it mattered so much is that voices are still there. And I believe, I'll return to this at the end of my remarks, that we can still hear those voices today. Those voices have in a way been hidden. And let me try to explain to you why and why this book is what I would call a populist history of the First World War, and that's one of the reasons why it matters. In 1915, on the British sector of the Western Front, the Manchester Guardian columnist Henry Nevinson wanted to write about the morale of British soldiers at the front. Nevinson was not basically at odds with the war, and he certainly was less outraged by it than his soon-to-be famous son, the artist Charles Nevinson, whose painting of dead British soldiers was censored in London in 1917. But 2 years before, his dad, Nevinson Père, approached a group of soldiers in a London regiment and asked them whether they were fighting for the Empire. And one of them said yes. That is what Nevinson reported to the readers of the Manchester Guardian a day later, and which we can read to this day. That was his voice. Well, we know from the Imperial War Museum's wonderful collection of letters, which included letters from the company in which this soldier fought, we know that the archives of the 1st and the 2nd London Division show that the story didn't end there. The day of the report appeared in The Guardian, and soldiers were very interested in what the press said about them and didn't say about them. They got extremely stroppy when they weren't mentioned. 3 of the mates of the man who responded to Nevinson asked him why he said yes. They said they weren't fighting for the British Empire. He said to them that he was fighting for the Empire Music Hall in Hackney. And I think one of the great achievements of World War I, A History in 100 Stories, is that it brings the story down to earth, down to the language of those who fought and suffered and endured the war and its aftermath, down to the domestic, the mundane, the ordinary, where all of us live. The 3 authors of this book attend to the language of the generation of the Great War. Too often, historians take big words to mean big things. But sometimes big words mean small things, no less powerful and attractive for that. Fighting for the empire or the nation or the cause could very easily mean fighting for the man on the left or the man on the right, fighting for the local pub or the Oktoberfest or the Tour de France or a hill or a valley in bloom in Snowdonia. I think this sense that there is a language of the First World War that endures to this day was captured by somebody who didn't get there, but sometimes writers and poets can hear things that we need to attend to. This is F. Scott Fitzgerald. He saw and heard that language and those places more than most who did. This is what his character, Dick Diver, said to his Rosemary, and he's pointing to the stream at the hill of Thiepval, separating Thiepval from Beaumont-Hamel, great massacres of the First World War. See that little stream, he said. See that little stream. We could walk it in 2 minutes. It took the British a month to walk it, a whole empire walking very slowly, dying in front and pushing forward behind, and another empire walked very slowly backward a few inches a day, leaving the dead like a million bloody rugs. No Europeans will ever do that again in this generation. And someone says, well, didn't the Americans invent it in the Civil War? No, not quite. They just invented mass butchery. This kind of battle, the Somme, was invented by Lewis Carroll and Jules Verne and whoever wrote Undine and Country Deacons, Bowling, and Marennes in Marseille, and Girls Seduced in the Back Lanes of Württemberg in Westphalia. Why, this was a love battle. There was a century of love spent here. This was the last love battle. You want to hand this story to D.H. Lawrence, says one of his companions. All my beautiful, lovely, safe world blew itself up here with a great gust of high explosive love. Dick mourned persistently. Isn't that true, Rosemary? I heard that love in the song, in the music we just heard. You can hear it in the language. You can read it in this wonderful book. All my beautiful, lovely, safe world. That is what fighting for the Empire Music Hall in Hackney meant. This book does many things. One is that it discloses that world in the process of transformation. Now, to be sure, none of us knows the shape of our lives while we are living them. The people in the war were caught in a trap, not at all of their own making. They went to war to defend one world, and by doing so ensured it would not survive the effort. That's why returning soldiers frequently felt odd at times after demobilization. The world they thought they had left behind, and nostalgia always creates a world that may not have existed, the world they thought they had left behind was in many respects no longer there. This wonderful collection of stories, a tapestry of national history, tells us about lives inflected by war, lives lost, lives redefined in a few short years. All these lives were set in the world of small things. Once they entered the war of very, very big things, the small got eclipsed. And to a degree, it has remained eclipsed the longer the great national myths of war have flourished. This is as true in this country, in Australia, as it is in Europe. The Great War created very, very big things. The biggest casualty lists in history, the biggest guns, the largest mountain range of munitions, the biggest pile of fodder for the biggest population of mobilized horses sent to war in history, the biggest national debt ever accrued, the biggest inflationary spirals in history, the biggest pandemic ever endured. Even, if you will, the biggest movie star of all time, Charlie Chaplin. Should anybody be surprised that big national narratives, what we term national myths, or stories which tell people who they think they are, emerged from the war as well? One of these stories, one of these myths, meaning a story that is true in a poetic sense, is the story of Anzac, a story about as big as they come in the history business. Charles Bean made it big and produced a very, very big and very unreadable official history to tell us all about it. And I do mean all about it. What this wonderful book has done today is to provide the signature of a new generation. And I think we should be both proud to be here to launch it and to reckon what it offers us in particular ways. This wonderful book has taken the Anzac legend and has brought it down to earth. And to be sure, through the intervention of the God of small things, the Anzac legend looks bigger for being reduced in size. Less is more. These are no superheroes, just ordinary people sustained by words from home, written by other ordinary people, swept up in the tides of war. Now, when Bruce and Ray and I and others helped launch the Cambridge history of the First World War last year, Ted Beaulieu wondered why John Monash's name wasn't in the index. He was grumpy about that. It is true. He was a big man with a big job and a very big name. And I think we have heard and will continue to hear much of the John Monashes of the world, and rightly so. But the question is, should they eclipse other names? Should they be the only names that we see? Should they tower so that we can't see the Bernard Walters or the Archibald Baxters or the Alexandrina Seegers? This is what I would call popular history, history of the people. And I do believe its origins are in the study of labor history, the study of people's movements, working class movements and women's movements, which has transformed itself into what we now call cultural history. But I think the origin is in those people, and there are many who have contributed to it, which wrote about, who have written about the people as well as about the wars they fought through. Now, this is popular history in one other respect. The bravery and the stamina of the men who fought the Great War have never been in question. What I and many others still wonder about is the disconnect between their war, the soldiers' war, and the war designed and commanded and perpetuated by their leaders, political and military alike. Most of those leaders were very, very limited men. There are exceptions, but I think this is a generally true statement. The charisma of leadership sometimes hides poverty of imagination. These people who ran the First World War on both sides had no idea to what extent their policies pushed thousands and thousands of men beyond the limits of human endurance. These great men were moral midgets, sleepwalkers, who could not see what was in front of their eyes, but instead sent men to fight against the big guns and were puzzled why the guns won. The editor of the obituaries of the London Times, he would be very upset that I'm citing him here, but it's a true story. The editor of the obituaries for the London Times told me that they were meant for the mustaches of this world. What he meant were the male military or administrative or political elites known to be important by their important mustaches. Sir John Monash had a very good mustache, and indeed a very good obituary in the Times. I think Ted Beaulieu may be still growing his. I hope it gets there in time. But once we shave the mustaches off, and I noticed one of the gentlemen in the 100 Stories has one on the right, but the other two, obviously one for age and one for choice, doesn't. Once we shave them off, the national portrait, we see lots of other people who deserve our attention. Men and women whose contribution to war is measured in small acts, which multiplied by millions make up a world at war. This book is about these people whose stature and hardships are the measure of a nation. Here is where the real Anzac tale lies. Here is where the next generation of students and scholars of history will begin. These three authors, all mustacheless, all three of them, the firm of Scates, Wheatley and James, and the university which has given them such a fine scholarly home have earned more than our respect. These three people are pioneers of the latest, and I would call it the second generation of the Anzac legend. And by that I mean the story of the people of this nation, and under at times endurable stress, who came through the war, broken and unbroken alike. The story of stress is more visible in these 100 stories, in this history, than in other histories of the war. There are many ways of writing about the history of war, but to appreciate it completely, we have to use the language of sadness. Norman Mailer once said that in writing about war, only those who are capable of using the word shit can use the word honor. Here in this book, there are terribly dark stories, and there are happier ones. And perhaps only by registering the sadnesses can we hear the joy of those fortunate enough to return in one piece to their homes and their families, because there were such individuals. Now, these achievements of this book in our profession collectively are also linked to teaching. And I think this is another point that I want to emphasize. Monash is unique, and I've been around for a while. You know, when you retire, I'm at the age of 70, I can truly say that I have a very brilliant future behind me. And the future behind me that I see has none of the deep dedication to teaching that I found at Monash. That the business of history is, as Alan Bennett put it, we're in the business of passing it on. And Monash is one of the great institutions of passing it on. We ought to recognize the university's honor in the achievement of these three authors. Now, let me end this invitation to you to join me in celebrating this book, a book in three voices, as I said, which is a rarity in our field. It is a democratic book, one which is not about the superheroes, but about the little heroes, the people whose commitment to the war freely given was, I believe, betrayed by their leaders. Moral pygmies like Lloyd George and Georges Clemenceau and Billy Hughes among them, who did not have the eyes to see that the world they led into war and then into peace was much worse off than it had been before 1914. If you want to face the question, what price victory, have a good look at this book and the wonderful photographs that show us, that make us feel part of a generation who paid the price for that war. Now, in many respects, today is a day to recognize that peace did not come to an end war did not come to an end 97 years ago. Yes, wearing a poppy is wearing a small war memorial. It's carrying a site of memory on your body. And I believe it is a fundamental way of recognizing something monstrous, something terrifying that happened 100 years ago. But I think we can pause and consider that if you look around, attend the exhibition, perhaps hear the voices, hear the songs and the silences of the generation of the Great War. If you read the book, I think you'll hear that those voices are with us still. Thank you very much.
As always, after hearing Jay speak, my mind's abuzz with questions. And normally we would have the opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions, but given the scale of tonight's event, that's not going to be possible. You'll have a chance to talk to Jay afterwards. But what we would like to do before we finish is to invite two of the authors of the 100 Stories project to respond. So please join me in welcoming our early career researchers, Laura James and Rebecca Wheatley, to the podium.
Before we begin for the thanks on behalf of all three of us, Laura and I really just wanted to express our thanks to Bruce for being the most inspiring and generous mentor to us both. So thank you, Bruce.
With every one of the 100 stories, we feel like we've got 100 people to thank. First and foremost, though, we would like to thank the descendants and the relatives of all the individuals examined in this book, who with courage and understanding entrusted us with their family stories. We would also like to thank all those wonderful members of the public who wrote in and contributed suggestions. In a way, this collection is an act of collaboration, told at the intersection between memory and history, and thus this book is richer for that. There is simply too many people to name individually, but we are lucky enough to have a few of these special people here with us tonight. George Gemmell, David Champion, the Vad and Well families. We've spotted you amongst we're sure many others, so thank you so much to you for making it here tonight to celebrate the launch of this book with us.
As with any historical study, the archives underpin this book. So many libraries, archives, galleries and museums generously facilitated our research, most notably the National Archives of Australia, the National Library of Australia, Museum Victoria, and all the state libraries and archives, and a whole host of historical and heritage societies at a national, state and local level. Perhaps, though, the repatriation records were the most important resource we used in this book. These records are critical to gaining a better understanding of the difficult and lasting legacy of the Great War. So thank you especially to JP, Jared and Ross, who are here tonight from the National Archives and who host the Monash University students and manage their internship work, cataloguing and digitising these files so that we and all of you now can access this collection. It's such a worthy project, and I'm sure we've only scratched the surface of the rich stories of this archive.
There are also a number of individuals whose wisdom and guidance have helped in the writing of this book, and they deserve a special thank you. Firstly, to Ray Francis. Thank you so much, Ray, for all your support, encouragement, and your clear and concise editing. The countless hours you spent correcting our appalling spelling and grammar and crossing out our feeble sentences have made this a much better book.
Thank you to Jay Winter, who is always a wonderful and patient guide in thoughtful reflection and who challenges us to be better historians.
To Frank Bongiorno, thank you for always listening and offering us great advice. Your input is always helpful and greatly appreciated.
And thank you to Rosalie Triolo, who is always such an enthusiastic supporter of our work and who goes out of her way to make good history available to teachers.
And to Ross McMullen, who assisted us in so many ways, from contributing photographs and indispensable material on some of our stories. Your support for this project has been invaluable.
Day to day, so many people at Monash University have offered us friendship and support, and they've assisted us in so many ways. We wanted to take this opportunity to make a special mention of 3 particular colleagues that have helped us and gone pretty much above and beyond whenever we've asked. Corrie McKee has helped us time and time again with a variety of requests. Stuart Lees, whose technology skills and imagination were so important in the formative stages of this project. And of course to Alice McConnell, who we could not have done without, especially at the pointy end of things. She helped bring everything to its completion and ensure that the book's finer details were achieved. And of course, Alice has done so much work in making tonight such a wonderful occasion.
The tireless effort, support and guidance and enthusiasm by the wonderful team at Penguin must also be acknowledged. To Andrea McNamara, thank you so much for seeking us out at the start and encouraging us to construct this book. Your belief in us and the continued interest in the stories has been greatly appreciated. We hope that your next endeavour goes well. To Andrea Davidson, you've done such a wonderful job. The care support you have provided us and your wonderful ability to answer all our crazy questions with such a calm manner is to be especially commended. We hope you didn't drive you too crazy. And to Laura Thomas, the time and effort that you put into making this book look so good was above and beyond everything we could have hoped for. You were so committed to every single detail, like the beautiful font that you crafted. It's to you that we owe the inclusion of so many wonderful photos, which have helped us tell the story of these individuals.
We also want to thank our friends and families, Ray Francis, Alex and Will Scates Francis and Bob Scates, Tom Ma, Kim, Sid, Melissa Wheatley and Ben Tawney, Greg and Rose Whidden, Greg, Sally and Luke James. It's been quite a journey, around 3.5 years now. In the beginning, we didn't really know where these 100 stories would go, but we were so lucky to have such unwavering enthusiasm and support from our families. It has been valuable moral support, so thank you for listening to the stories as they unfolded and for listening to us grumble for research dead ends and so on. Greg, Tom, and we've often asked for practical support that went well beyond reasonable requests as well. Greg, Tom and Will have all spent hours in the archives with us, helping us locate and copy records.
And to Ray, Melissa, Sally and poor little Rose, we have each wandered through countless cemeteries and visited war memorials across Australia. We're very sorry to have dragged you around. Also to Jan, to Tim, to Michelle and to Amshu, thank you so much for travelling interstate to be here for the occasion as well. Thank you very much to our families for listening, reading, offering advice and travelling with us each step of the way. We really appreciate everything that you have done for us in helping us be here tonight. And finally, to conclude, we'd like to say thank you very much to all of you here tonight for coming here to celebrate the launch of this book. Cheers.
And as well as our guests here tonight, I'd like to add a few special thanks for people who've participated in making tonight's evening the very special occasion that it has been, particularly Adrian Leith and our hosts at Museum Victoria. It's a great partnership that Monash University has with this institution, and we hope to have many more events here in the future. Alice McConnell was mentioned in the context of the book, but she's also been fabulous in helping us prepare for tonight. And also the team from Monash, Grace Rutherford, Chris Albertson, and the other Monash students and alumni who volunteered to help us this evening when we realised we were getting slightly more people here than we had originally expected. And Mark and his amazing crew who captured tonight on film, or at least we hope he did. We began tonight's proceedings with a song about Fromelles, and we'll end now in the same way. As many of you will know, one of the most common epitaphs chosen by families to mark the graves of the men who were recovered at Fromelles carry these simple words: "I once was lost, but now I'm found." To close tonight, and in a gesture of remembrance this Remembrance Day, Katie Manny will sing Amazing Grace. Katie.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieve.
I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Kate, you'll be interested to know, is one of the Monash interns who's volunteered to work next year in Flanders Field Museum in Ypres in Belgium. And I expect that she'll sing that song again at the Menin Gate. Now, the final thing we need to do tonight is a gesture from Bruce and myself to the people who have contributed to tonight's proceedings and the opportunity to take a photo. So could I ask John and Marcy and Beck and Laura and Kate and Bruce and Jay to come up on the stage, please. Bruce doesn't need showers or flowers or champagne. He has me. That concludes the formal part of tonight's proceedings. You will have noticed that they are selling books, so if you haven't bought a copy outside, you get a special discount price tonight, and the three authors are here to sign. So thank you once again, and please join us for more refreshments and conversation outside.